Organised crime has increased across Africa during the COVID-19 pandemic and shows no signs of slowing down, with syndicates getting better at effectively adapting to lockdown restrictions and manipulating them for the purpose of their movements. That is according to the 2021 Organised Crime Index. For more on this, we're joined by Julian Rademeyer, who's the director of the Organised Crime Observatory for East and Southern Africa at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. Julian, a very good evening to you. Grateful for your time. No surprise then that South Africa is in the top 5 of countries worst affected.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Temkile. I think what is really interesting about the findings of this index is that South Africa has moved up since our first index in 2019, the first Africa index looking at 54 countries across Africa. South Africa has moved up from back then when it was in at a lower level than it currently is. It currently ranks about number 5 out of 54 countries in Africa on the criminality score. But interesting enough, it ranks second out of those countries for resilience. So we have two metrics at play with this particular index, where we rate criminality across 12 measurable criminal markets and then also criminal actors. And then we look at the resilience of those countries to organized crime. And South Africa, unfortunately, has dropped since the 2019 index when it was in 10th position. It's now in 5th position as far as criminality goes. It was 9th for resilience in 2019. It's now in 2nd place.
What do you mean by resilience?
So what we define is the ability of a society or the ability of a country, and that includes not only governments and states, but also non-state actors, civil society, to respond to organized crime. And not just to respond to organized crime to individual markets, but to respond to organized crime as a whole. So South Africa has extremely high levels of organized crime. But it also has systems in place. It also has a vibrant civil society. It has legislation in place. It is showing some improvements in efforts to combat organized crime, although obviously a great deal still needs to be done, particularly after the erosion of law enforcement and other agencies over the last 10 to 13 years. But South Africa is well positioned, and it's actually unique in some ways on the African continent and globally, in being one of only 2 countries on the African continent that scores both high at a resilience level, but also on a criminality level. If you look globally, there are only around 9 countries that score similarly, and in that case, you look at countries like the United States, France, and Malaysia, where there are tools and structures in place to combat organized crime, but high levels of organized crime at the same time.
I wanted to ask you about state-embedded actors whom you mentioned. In this report, you say they grew more powerful and, in fact, tightened their grip, as it were, on state resources. Are we referring here to government ministers, as we've seen in some of the big corruption allegations in South Africa, or are there other people involved?
Yeah, I think what we're referring to is a trend that we've seen across Africa and since the 2019 index. And that does not only mean government ministers. In most cases, actually, we're talking about much lower level officials within government, officials who corrupt processes, officials involved in tender corruption and fraud, that kind of organized crime elements. But I think you can extrapolate that to look at issues around state capture. Certainly there was a degree of organization in some of those instances. There were groups of people, and depending on which definition of organized crime you follow, but groups of people who came together with a very key and structured task and set about achieving that task. Similarly, we see in the revelations around Eskom and corruption in Eskom, that much of that was very orchestrated. So I think that it's the capture of state institutions, and it ranges from low-level officials to high-level officials.
Something else that struck me in this report is how you focused on South Africa as a human trafficking hotspot, where either as a transit point or people being taken right off our shores. Because just a week or 2 ago, we were talking right here on the program about the alarming number of kidnappings, more and more people coming forward saying, actually, people are being snatched off the road and never seen again.
Yeah, exactly. And again, this is a trend that we're seeing across the continent. Human trafficking, human smuggling, two quite distinct things, but human trafficking growing, human smuggling growing, and some of that ties directly, in particular in human smuggling, moving migrants from place to place, ties in directly with the impact of the pandemic. But certainly there's grave cause concern around human trafficking in South Africa. We've seen cases where people are being targeted, people are being exploited through labor or being enforced labor. There's the threat of sex trafficking. And it's one of those issues. There's a lot of movement of people between South Africa and other countries. And because of the South Africa's economic status within the region, it attracts many people. So again, it's one of those high-level issues that I think requires a great deal of focus by law enforcement.
And on law enforcement then, are we seeing a rise in the success of organized crime because law enforcement is too slow to act, or because law enforcement does not know how to act?
I think it's a combination of the two. I think we've been through very difficult times. There's been an overall decline, certainly an overall increase in instability in South Africa over the last 13 years. I think we've seen extraordinary damage done to the institutions that are meant to tackle organized crime. We only have to look at the Police Crime Intelligence Unit as an example. We only have to look at the efforts and political meddling and corruption that destabilized the National Prosecuting Authority in recent years. The State Security Agency, again, a key element in tackling organized crime. Long-standing abuse of that agency, use of that agency for political means. I think that we are hopefully seeing more encouraging signs now where there are efforts to try and turn that around. But this is going to be an incredibly long-term process. As people in the construction industry would say, it's very easy to break things down. It's incredibly difficult to build them up, and that takes so much longer. Particularly in the Zuma years, we saw how those institutions were eroded. So I think what is critical to ensure at this point, and this is going to be a long-term process, and not something that's going to change overnight, is that we ensure stability in law enforcement agencies that have been hollowed out, crippled, and corrupted. We ensure that those institutions have the support that they need to operate. We ensure that they have the skills, that they have the resources that they need to conduct and carry out investigations. That is so vital to tackling this issue.
Julian, so good to speak to you. That was the director of the Organised Crime Observatory for East and Southern Africa, the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime, Julian Rademeyer.